This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us to talk about the hookup culture and some of the problems that it causes and some of the solutions to those problems is Dr. Timothy O'Malley. Thanks for being here, Dr. O'Malley.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So the term is thrown around a lot. Some might be very familiar with it, some less so. How would you define the hookup culture?
Well, the hookup culture is actually intentionally ambiguous. It's a term that can mean anything from a couple or a sort of young two people making out before they actually have any relationship to anything to sexual intercourse. Mm-hmm. But really what's at the heart of it is the ambiguity that before any relationship proceeds, before anyone really knows anything about the other person in any substantial way, there's a physical encounter that sort of defines the relationship.
So how common is the hookup culture, and I guess how problematic is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can think about two strands of the hookup culture. The first is, there's certainly an assumption, and I think if you pay attention to the world around us, we're formed to presume that hooking up, that physical relationships are how all love starts. Think about most sitcoms today versus 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Anything dealing with romance begins with sex, and so that cultural script, that narrative has begun. But secondarily, it's also, I think, a real lack of communication, a lack of what authentic intimacy and friendship consists of. And so a lot of people who are lost in trying to explore what it means to be a human being, instead of finding this in some sort of bigger narrative of intimacy, of friendship with another person, they have to express it through physical relationships.
And I suppose even our secular culture would admit to some of the immediate problems and consequences of hookup culture, like unplanned pregnancy or sexually transmitted diseases or higher instances of assault or harassment. But what about some of the long-term consequences of people that are growing up in a hookup culture?
Actually, both kind of religious and secular people are concerned about this. I think even secular people are aware even the long-term consequences seems to be a failure of any sort of authentic sense of love, a really warped sense of human sexuality, a real problem with fidelity, what constitutes fidelity, and how do we stay committed to a person for more than 15 minutes. And so you actually see a good deal of, at the diagnostic level, some real concerns. I think the difference is what's the medicine that heals the problem. And I think, relative to those who are involved in secularity, it often involves, well, let's talk about what constitutes good sex. Let's talk about the theme of consent. Whereas religious people, I think, have to ask some larger questions or values about, well, what is a human relationship at all? What's the end towards which it's directed between man and woman? What is that romantic relationship directed to? And I think that's the bigger question for religious people, especially Catholics.
Well, and one of the things that you do in your book is tie this in with the concept of liturgy. So can you explain, we're familiar with liturgy as being probably the Mass or an expression of our faith in that way. So how would you define liturgy, and then how do you tie that in with the hookup culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a variety of liturgies. The Mass is not exclusively the liturgy. And so one of the liturgies that's really quite essential for marriage would be the sacrament of marriage, the rite by which one is married. And so the liturgy of marriage is a kind of weird liturgy because it's not very long. But what it does is it forever changes the couple by uniting them together in the act of consent. When they make those vows of love to love one another forever, that actually establishes the couple as a kind of offering to God, a sacrifice to God. And so there really is a kind of change in that couple's identity so that the entirety of their relationship now is lived out with Christ's charity, with Christ's love at the center. And so that liturgy comes to be really healing and defining for those obsessed with hookup culture or those abiding in it, because one of our problems is an intimacy, a failure of any love that transcends but a moment. And in marriage, we find a love that definitely transcends a moment. It transcends everything insofar as it actually is linked to Christ's very love.
So is a sacramental marriage a cure for the hookup culture in the fact that kind of people could do whatever you want leading up to it, and then you get a Catholic marriage and you're all set?
Well, that's not really how sacraments work.
Okay.
Certainly every sacrament is both healing and sanctifying, but marriage, of course, as a sacrament, has a transformation that takes place, but it also requires a moral commitment. And so I think that one of the problems with those who've offered cures to the hookup culture is they speak about it exclusively at a moral level, right? Okay, so we need to have less sex, or we need to sort of be more pure. This becomes a form of works righteousness, and it's also difficult because human beings are sinful creatures. And so what the sacrament of marriage does is it provides for us grace, a gift from God, that gives us a new vision, a new possibility of what human love could be. And the result of marriage is to live up to that. And so, no, I mean, if you get married and you've looked at pornography and you've hooked up a lot and you've cheated on your spouse, the sacrament of marriage isn't going to be some sort of cure-all for that disorder of love. Rather, one has to sort of bring, the liturgical dimension of it is that you have to bring yourself ready to receive all that is gift, all that is good, all that's love unto the end, into the right. So no, it's not a cure in that sense, like no sacrament is. Certainly not even the sacrament of penance is that. You actually require a conversion, a desire to move away from one's sins. And so, yes, it heals, yes, it sanctifies, but it requires the full gift of ourself to do so.
All right. We're talking with Dr. Tim O'Malley. The book is Off the Hook: God, Love, Dating, and Marriage in a Hookup World. And you talk about the hookup culture as a liturgy in and of itself. Can you explain that?
Well, in some ways, I mean, I'm taking this term from a philosopher, James K. Smith, who refers to the manner in which we're formed by practices. I think Americans often think about religious formation as a matter of ideas. And so we think, okay, if we have the right ideas, then everything will be great. One of our problems is, of course, we're formed in practices even before we have ideas around it. And so a lot of the practices of the hookup culture, things like an inability to commit, the reduction of the person that we're attracted to a sexual object, these write themselves upon our bodies well even before we're able to respond to them or just sort of be aware of them. And so it is a kind of series of practices that form us, or should I say malform us. And so that's what I mean is, even if, for example, you're not the kind of person who hooked up, we were formed in cultures where hooking up was normative, and therefore, as a series of practices, it may have formed you to expect the hookup to be normal. The example I give all my students is, think about one of the dimensions of the hookup is the prevalence of sex at the heart of a relationship. And so a married couple may come to the conclusion that sex, even a Catholic married couple may enter into a marriage with the assumption that the most important thing that happens is sex. And of course, that really causes huge problems in the marriage. And so it's a practice that forms you even before you have the idea of it. In fact, you might even think you don't have the idea, but it's only in the context of the relationship that you realize, oh my gosh, I believed this thing that I would never have thought that I believed.
So where is the first place to attack these misconceptions? How do we approach this, and when is the right time and place to do so?
Yeah, we need to approach much younger. And so it's a comprehensive formation program. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is to establish from the very beginning relationships of intimacy, relationships of friendship. What kind of practices do we engage in the home to encourage intimacy, of friendship, of real communication? The first way to end the hookup culture is for parents to put their smartphones away when they come home. To be with their kids. The first step is to really speak to your children as they get older about what authentic relationship involves, about what the nature of love is, to help deconstruct some of the commercials, the advertisements that form us to expect that this is normative. These are the kind of conversations we have to have from the very beginning. And I think so it starts quite young. I mean, I think it starts with 5 and 6-year-olds. Certainly at 5 or 6, we're not talking to our children about the hookup culture, but we're establishing what authentic intimacy, what authentic friendship is. And actually that act of education will form our children when they enter into dating practices themselves.
And then for those that are caught up in that culture and are in the dating age bracket, do you think when they're caught up in a hookup culture, they see it around them? Are they seeing this as, this is fine, it's good, it's normal? Or is it just, I'm caught up into it like an addiction that I can't get out, but I realize this is harmful?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's somewhere between an addiction and a culture. Most of my students find that actually they're not happy with it. They, for the most part, this will be a trend for them. They're not even aware of the various ways that it will affect them later on in life. They think, well, this is the time in college, this is the time as a young adult in which I engage in such practices, and in the future I'll move on to something else. many students come to me and say, like, well, I don't want this. I want to get out of it. I'm hooking up with this girl, and what I really want is to date her. How do I do that? And so I think another dimension of this formation is to really teach practices of dating, practices of relationship, practices of friendship amongst young adults and moving forward. I think too many of our young people don't actually know how to communicate with one another. They don't know the actual steps by which one dates another person.
So what would those steps be?
Well, I think, one of the first steps that we have is, do we talk to the person? Do we actually look them in the eye? Where is our first encounter? Our first encounter can't be in a dorm room with 150 people drunk. Our first encounter has to be to actually sort of communicate to someone, hey, I'd like to know more about you. I'd like to find out a little bit about you. Can I take you out on a date? And so then going on the date where you actually sort of speak to someone, and the first date may not actually be the fact that you're meeting the person that you're going to know for the rest of your life forever and ever. Amen. It's actually sort of an occasion to have an authentic conversation with a person in an environment that isn't infused with drinks, with alcohol, and with the assumption that at the end of the night, sex is going to happen.
Who did you write the book for?
Well, I wrote it for lots of people, certainly young adults. It's based out of a class that I teach at Notre Dame on the sacrament of marriage. I have 150 students in the class, and I came to recognize how some part of the class really met a need. I also wrote it for those involved in marriage formation. I think it's really important as we think through marriage formation. Whenever I talk to bishops or priests involved in marriage formation around the hookup culture, they always say it's brand new information. And so I'm worried about that because, those who are being formed in the church today for marriage, those who are coming for formation, are deeply affected by this. And so you can't sort of just have a communications workshop and think everything's going to be fine. It really needs to be a spiritual formation, a reformation into the heart of what the sacrament consists of, and dealing with those misaligned desires that are harmful for us.
And what are some of the other topics that you talk about in the book? I know you talk about consent and a lot of these kind of hot button issues right now.
Well, it's sort of as a walk through marriage. And so each of the chapters, first chapter will deal with a kind of sociological account of what hooking up is. The second chapter is a philosophy of love. How do we actually talk about love? And I use the work of St. John Paul II, a good deal within that chapter. The third chapter then moves into the scriptures, the liturgy, the word for marriage. How do we listen to God's good news for what love and what marriage consists of? The next chapter moves on to the heart of the sacrament of marriage, the act of consent. And then the last chapter deals with the Eucharist and family life, because the sacrament of marriage, like all the sacraments, are ordered to the Eucharist. And so how is the whole dimension of family life transformed to the Eucharist, really becoming a space for self-giving love?
Such important topics and such an important book. I appreciate you writing it and sharing with us. Where can people get a copy of it?
Well, you can get it at Ave Maria, and of course you can get it at that giant behemoth that is Amazon.
All right. Again, it's called Off the Hook: God, Love, Dating, and Marriage in a Hookup World. Thank you so much, Dr. Timothy O'Malley, for sharing this with us today. I appreciate it.
So thanks for having me on, and thanks for letting me talk about something that's important.